All right, I've got a great book here. One of my all-time favorite. It's written by Patricia Beatty. She was the winner of the Skedaddle Award for Historical Fiction the year of this printing. The book title is Charley, Skedaddle. Now, Patricia Beatty is known for her books Turn Homeward, Hannah Lee, Lupita Mañana, Jayhawker, just to name a few. But Charley Skedaddle, this one stands out to me as a great story. It's about a young man growing up in the Bowery during the Civil War, and he has an idea what it is to be a man. But you know what? Like all good main characters, there are lessons to be learned, and he learns a big one on what it truly means to be a man. So let's get down to it. Chapter 1, A Bowery Boy. As he set the hat box on a crate beside him, Charlie Quinn heard the words in his head. "If ever you got to fight alone, Charlie, me lad, get your back to a wall." Right now, it was as if his older brother Johnny had spoken to him. His words flashed through Charlie's mind as the thick-set boy, a member of the Dead Rabbits gang, walked menacingly toward him through the cool March rain of early dusk. Carefully, 12-year-old Charlie stepped backward to the brick wall, his feet planted firmly in the mud of the Bowery alley, his fists raised and ready the way Johnny had taught him. This was how the best, most famous boxers in New York City fought. Johnny had known all about them. He'd even met a few in saloons before he'd gone off to war at 23. He'd been the best fighter in the Bowery and chief of the Bowery Boys gang. Charlie's eyes bored into the dimness of the dirty alley. Looking for help from one of the other Bowery Boys, there was no chance of aid from his brother, Johnny. Johnny Quinn, who had fought bravely against the Dead Rabbits in the Great Fight of 1857. Handsome Johnny lay now under the earth in Pennsylvania at a place called Gettysburg. Gone off to be a soldier, he died last year, falling with the other heroes of the 140th New York Veterans Volunteers. Charlie knew, too, that there'd be no help from the other members of his gang. He'd left them 10 minutes ago at one of the new shooting galleries the Bowery boasted. Why hadn't he stayed longer with them and let his sister wait a bit more? Now he'd been caught by a prowling dead rabbit. Alone and weary from hours of dodging the dangerous horse-drawn omnibuses on Broadway, this would be a one-on-one fight, because no other members of the Dead Rabbits gang were around either. Well, that was good. He had no fear of a one-on-one fight. The Dead Rabbit spoke first, raising his voice over the roar of a busy Broadway a few streets away. "A Bowery boy, ain't ya? You wouldn't be here if you wasn't." "You bet," cried Charlie. "And I can tell from the red stripes on your breeches that you're a dead rabbit. What are you doing here?" "I'm passing through. I beat Tom Bailey from Mott Street. You want fight?" Charlie replied, "Are you planning to fight me with a knife? If you are, I tell you I got one too, and it's sharp enough to suit me." The Dead Rabbit scoffed. My fist'll do tonight. That'll be plenty for the likes of you no-good Irisher." "Come and try this, Irisher," was Charlie's taunt. "Come and try me, Tom Bailey." The Dead Rabbit took the challenge. Running forward, he flung himself at Charlie, his fists flailing wildly. Coolly as Johnny had taught him, Charlie ducked the first punches, catching those meant for his face on his forearms and swinging shoulders. Then, when Tom, in his rush, had gone too far off balance, Charlie came in under his guard with a hard left to the side of his head, followed by a harder right to his nose. Howling Tom fell back, holding his nose, now streaming blood. The Dead Rabbit wasn't through, though. He came charging back at Charlie. Fighting more warily now, one of his punches landed on Charlie's left eye and another on his cheek. Charlie groaned, not from the pain he felt, but for what Noreen Quinn, and Mr. Damaris would say when they saw his bruised face. He'd hoped to win this fight unmarked. Angry now, Chark sailed into the dead rabbit, punching hard and kicking too, because when the two gangs clashed, they didn't fight by any rules. One of Charlie's feet shot out behind Tom's left one and hooked it. Surging backward, he brought the dead rabbit down and leapt on him as he lay on his back in a large, shallow mud puddle. Straddling Tom Brady, aware that he was getting the knees of his best trousers wet and muddy, Charlie gestured with his fist and asked, "Have you had enough of me for now?" Yeah, I've had enough." Just then a loud, deep, masculine voice called out, "I think you both have had enough." And Charlie felt a strong hand pluck him off the dead rabbit and set him on to his feet. "Ye run," the man ordered Tom. "And don't let me see ye here again, ye hear?" Tom got up swiftly, his nose still bleeding. He glared at Charlie and the huge policeman and fled down the alley. "Let me go," squawked Charlie, as the big Irishman in the long blue coat and gold-painted helmet held him up, his feet swinging. The Metropolitan only laughed. Suddenly, he let the boy fall to a crouch in the mire. He said, "I seen ye before. Ye were with Noreen Quinn. Ye have the look of each other, the Quinn look, the red hair, the pale face, and the eyes of blue." Panting, Charlie nodded. "Yes, I'd be her brother. And fighting too. There was a dead rabbit ran away just now, so ye'd be a Bowery boy." It was wisest not to admit the truth, so Charlie muttered, "I don't belong to any gang." "A likely story. I know ye to be a Bowery boy, all right. The youngest one of all, even if ye aren't wearing your red shirt now. I know your brother, Johnny Quinn, before he went off to war and got hisself killed at Round Top. If he hadn't enlisted, he might have died in another scrap like the one in 57 between your gang and the rabbits. I saw it. It lasted long enough for the state militia to be called out to stop it. Hundreds of ye was there." Wiping mud and rain from his face, Charlie said nothing. The important thing now was to get away from this Metropolitan. The man knew too much about him. It was on the tip of his tongue to tell him his brother never would have been killed in a great street fight in New York. He'd been too smart for that. But instead, Charlie said, "You didn't arrest that dead rabbit, so you shouldn't take me in either." "I don't intend to." Charlie breathed deep with relief. He turned to pick up the hat box and leave, but once more the hand reached out to collar him. The Metropolitan said, "I don't intend to arrest ye, but I do intend to take ye home to your sister." "I was going there anyway." "How do you know my sister?" demanded Charlie. "I seen her and her young feller Michael Damaris at Mass on Sundays. I seen ye with her there. One time only it was. From walking my beat, I know she lives on Christie Street." Wanting to be rid of the policeman as soon as possible, Charlie started to move off when the big hand stopped him once more. "Just one thing more, young Quinn. Did ye thieve that box ye have with ye?" Stung, the boy told him, "No, I didn't. It's my sister's. I work with her. I take the bonnets she trims to Jennings on Broadway and fetch back the untrimmed ones and ribbons and laces she needs from R.H. Macy's and Lord and Taylor's. Look in the box if you don't believe me. There's nothing there but bonnets." The Metropolitan laughed. "I believe ye. I was but teasing. I spotted ye afar with the hat box. Quite a little gent ye looked. If I didn't know better about ye, I planned to deliver ye home before there's another dead rabbit after ye. Come along with me now." Held fast by the collar, Charlie and the policeman paraded through the gas-lit Bowery, past concert saloons, oyster houses, leather goods stores, grog shops, and dance halls filled with loud music and shrill laughter. The laughter from the many billiard parlors was deeper because women didn't go into them. The sharp crack of rifles struck his ears from the shooting galleries. Inside one he spied members of his gangs, but their backs were turned to him as they waited for their chance with the rifles. Johnny had been a fine shot at the shooting galleries, and Charley himself was doing better all the time. It wasn't fair that a rebel bullet had gotten his brother at Gettysburg before he'd fired off one shot himself. That one bullet had killed him. One shout of help from him, Charley knew, would bring some of his gang tumbling out to argue with the Metropolitan, but he didn't cry out to them. He was too embarrassed. How they'd laughed to see him almost dangling at the end of the policeman's arm, tripping along like a lady toe dancer. He knew he looked ridiculous. Whiskery men in top hats and long black cloaks, and women in bright-colored hoop-skirt gowns laughed as they passed him. Soldiers in Union blue went by laughing too, while the hooves of horses drawing streetcars on rails and noisy iron-rimmed carriage wheels splashed more mud on him and his captor. The Metropolitan propelled Charley into the entryway of a 2-story brown brick building and up 2 flights of steps. He stopped at the door where the Quinns lived in 3 small, shabbily furnished rooms, and rapped. To Charley's dismay, it wasn't Noreen who opened the door, but the man she was pledged to marry, tall, lean, black-haired Mr. Michael Damaris. Behind him, Charley could see his sister and another seamstress, her friend, Mrs. O'Neill. Noreen rose from her sewing machine, looking alarmed. The hateful Mr. Damaris, in the cold way he had about him, asked, "Ah, Sergeant, what have you brought to my door?" His door. Anger grew high in Charley Quinn. This little dingy flat had been rented by his parents long ago when they first came from Ireland. His father had gone west to work on the canals when Charley had been a baby, and had never been heard of again. His mother had died of consumption 5 years back. But the Quinns had stayed on in the flat. Noreen, the oldest of them all at 27, had paid the rent and bought most of the food with the money she earned from her skills with the needle. No one trimmed hats better or faster in the city. First, Johnny, then Charley, had delivered bonnets for her. The policeman said with a deep rumbling chuckle, "I'd say in truth 'tis a drowned rat I have here. Might as well take him anyway." The hat box fell from his hand and skidded across the floor as Charley was pushed onto the floor to fall at his sister's feet. When he looked up into her black-fringed blue eyes, he saw pain and embarrassment there, and sad weariness too. She told the officer, "Thank ye, sir, for fetching him home to me. I see he's been fighting. Is he hurt bad?" "No, I'm not," growled Charley. "It was just fists." Michael Damaris mocked. "What, no pistols or clubs or knives this time? How many of you were there? 100 at least, I suppose." Charley flared. "Just me and the rabbit. I wish it had been more." He looked at the man with hatred. A clerk in a bank, that was all Damaris was, a pen pusher. He hadn't gone into the army when Johnny had, though his brother had expected him to. Damaris had weak eyes. Weak indeed. His glasses were thick, but not so thick that he hadn't spotted pretty Noreen Quinn at Mass 2 years ago and made her acquaintance with boldness. Damaris loved money, and Noreen made decent wages, more than she could have made working as a housemaid in a big house on Fifth Avenue where rich people lived. She took work into her own home, toiling far into the night at her sewing machine. The whir of its treadle had been a lullaby to Charley when he was very small. How could she marry this stingy stick of a man who considered a stroll in a new and handsome Central Park or a ride on a horse-drawn omnibus a great treat to Noreen from him? If Johnny were alive, he'd put a stop to that. Noreen and Damaris had only been betrothed for 6 months. While Charley glared, the Metropolitan told Noreen, "The other lad was getting the worst of it. 'Tis only fair to say so." Charley got up and said to the policeman, "I thank you for telling her I was winning." He stood watching as the man touched his fingers to his helmet brim, to Noreen and a silent Mrs. O'Neill, and closed the door behind him. In an instant, Noreen was on to Charley. In a fury, she cried, "Fighting again, are ye? You promised me, Charley Quinn, that he'd fight no more while he did errands for me. Look at ye. Those are ye best clothes." Charley wiped his face with the torn sleeve of his black and white check suit. He looked down at his high-buttoned boots, more brown now than black with alley mud, and at his filthy stockings and stained knee pants. He looked a Jim dandy, delivering bonnets to the milliners that day. He'd been smiling and soft-spoken and polite whenever he'd gone. Not only was it Noreen's money and the change from her purchases that jingled in his pockets, but also tips from the ladies he charmed. All had gone right as could be until he'd met the dead rabbit. That was bad luck of the worst sort. Noreen demanded, "Why do you fight in your best clothes? Why do you fight at all?" "I had to fight tonight. He came at me first. He was a dead rabbit. I could have run away from him, could I? And why not?" Charley looked in despair at Damaris, who, he thought, ought to understand at least this much about manliness. But the man only smiled his thin smile without nodding. What kind of Irishman was he? "Why not run?" Charley protested to his sister. "If I ran, my gang would be sure to hear about it." "And what is so wrong with that? Michael and I are getting married next month. We just decided. Then we'll all of us move across town to a nicer place. That will be the end of your Bowery boys and your dead rabbits, too. I hate them all. Mother hated it when Johnny was a Bowery boy, and now ye are too." "I have to be, Noreen, because of him." "No, ye don't have to be. Now go wash your face. I say ye are to stay in tonight. We were only waiting for ye to come home so we can go out to Niblo's theater. Mrs. O'Neill is treating us. Her husband sent money to her from the army. If ye hadn't ruined your suit, ye could have go too." "Yes, Charley, ye were invited too," said Mrs. O'Neill, a plump, black-haired woman, older than Noreen. Charley mumbled, "I don't want to go to Niblo's." Now for the first time he noticed that his sister was wearing her dark blue taffeta gown with the white rosebuds at the neck. She always looked like a grand lady in it. Walking stiff-legged past Damaris, Charley went to the tiny room he had shared with Johnny. He turned up the gas lamp, lit it, and then picked up the full water pitcher, pouring its contents into the basin. He got his towel from the washstand and looked into his piece of broken mirror. He saw with fierce joy that his eye was already turning black, and his cheek was red and torn. It had been a good fight, even if it had come at the wrong time. Dabbing at his face with a wet towel, he heard Damaris's voice through his partially open door. "I tell you, Noreen, that brother of yours ought to be kept in a cage. I'll put up with him living with us if you insist, though you know I don't fancy him or want him. If he comes with us, I'll see that your Charley toes my mark." Noreen's voice was wheedling. "And if he doesn't, Michael? He's a lot like Johnny. Nobody could ever do a thing with him." "Then, my dear, your brother will go to a home for incorrigible boys or to an orphanage. Nothing must come between us and our love. Nothing and no one. There are places for boys like Charley." Charley held his breath. What would his sister say? Would she order Damaris out right now? Just then Mrs. O'Neill put in, "Michael has the right of it, Noreen." Again there was silence. Then Noreen Quinn said softly, "Yes, Michael, Charley must behave better. He'll understand when I tell him. I'll speak with him in the morning, and he'll behave." Unwilling to hear more, Charley plunged his whole head into the basin, sputtering like the ocean seal he'd seen in the tank at P.T. Barnum's museum. He felt sick to his stomach. Noreen would tell him tomorrow, would she? She'd let him squirm under the thumb of Mr. Michael Damaris? She'd take him away from the Bowery boys, Johnny's gang, his only friends? Didn't she know how much he missed Johnny? The volunteer fireman, strongest man on the pumps in the Tompkins No. 30 Engine Company on Christie Street? Lifting his dripping head, Charley heard the door closing into the hallway. Anger rose inside him. The devil Noreen would take him away from the Bowery. The devil Damaris would keep him a prisoner, even if he wanted to drag him all the way out to Harlem to live on a little farm. Be damned if he'd stay inside tonight. Be damned. Chapter 2, The Men in Blue coming up.